lost opportunities.
Hello all and welcome back. Does my microphone work? I'll take that as a yes, cool. So welcome back, hope your lunch break was satiating. So we have two more teams left to present for the final topic, which is a disinformation campaign during an electoral period. So the exact scenario given to the, before that, the judges, my bad. So the judges for this panel are J.C. Boucher, assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and at the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. He's currently Director of Research in Civil and Military Relations at the CDSN, which is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Council. Finally, he specializes in international relations with an emphasis on Canadian foreign and defense policies, international security, and methodology. The second and final judge for today is Rachel Babins, who currently works in incident response, so cybersecurity, at, I believe, RBC or RBC, and previously held positions in threat intelligence. In 2019, she received an MA in Russian Studies from the University of Toronto, where she also did a thesis on Russian disinformation targeting NATO's enhanced forward presence mission in the Baltics. In 2021, she founded the Emerging Leaders in Canadian Security, ELCS, an organization focused on resourcing, connecting, and unifying Canada's next generation of security practitioners, ultimately working to build a more diverse and skilled, secure Canada. So now to the exact scenario given to the participants. It is the 2025 federal election. The CBC, CTV, and National Post report that there has been an increase in the spread of political memes and reports condemning an alleged 15% petroleum tax, which is in quotes, by the way, a hike by the government. Further stories condemn the current government's environmental goals as being unattainable and unfairly targeting hardworking Canadians. Upon further investigation, it is discovered that Russian-hacked trolls have been spreading this information on Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, and Parler. So the participants here have been tasked with tackling that. I'll leave the floor to you.
All right. So first of all, I'd like to thank Carleton University and everybody else who helped organize this fantastic conference. We are going to be talking about disinformation as it pertains to Canada and its electoral structure. One back. Yeah. Okay, so disinformation is a pretty highly contested concept, and it's been defined differently within different contexts, both geopolitical and historical. The way that we defined it, especially as it pertains to Canada, is that Canada is a form of information which essentially misleads or misconstrues the events or information about current Canadian politics. And so Canada is currently and will likely continue to be victim to coordinated online disinformation campaign by foreign adversaries. Consequently, the 2025 federal election is expected to see large amounts of online disinformation created by countries like Russia and China. It is therefore imperative that the Canadian government develops a comprehensive response to online disinformation. And so we've essentially identified three primary effects of foreign disinformation campaigns within Canada. The first being undermining Canadian democracy, and so that is Canada's electoral institutions and mechanisms in the way that it alters the manner in which constituents and voters tend to react to politicians and tend to cast their votes. The second is a reduction in institutional trust. Institutions here means both private corporations, public sector institutions, as well as generally the kind of norms that regulate Canadian society. And then our the final point that we've identified for a main effect of a foreign disinformation campaign in Canada is inciting increased polarization. So the exacerbation of polarization is something that we've seen on the rise across North America over the past few years, and is something that not only contributes to these other two factors of undermining democracy and reducing institutional trust, but also tears at the social fabric of our nation.
So our policy takes a broad, multi-stakeholder, long-term approach to tackling disinformation as an issue. We don't believe that it's sufficient to just try to, for example, fact-check disinformation as it comes up. So we have taken a 5-step approach that centers around detection, attribution, foreign response, domestic response, and inoculation. You will also see on each slide that there is a combination of immediate actions and sustainable initiatives. Immediate actions are denoted by the orange text, sustainable initiatives are denoted by the green text, and this is just to really emphasize the fact that disinformation is not just a one-moment threat. This is a long-term issue that's going to involve many stakeholder involvement, and it's going to require long-term initiatives as well as immediate responses. On each slide, you will see 3 columns. The first column gives our kind of specific policy suggestion. The middle column suggests who we believe would be most responsible for carrying out that policy. And the third column describes the specific value of that policy.
Yeah, so although Canada has begun to counter disinformation, particularly regarding Russia, it has been limited. Efforts to detect disinformation appear to be reliant on other alliances, such as NATO, G7, the Media Freedom Coalition, and the Freedom Online Coalition. We believe that Canada should take a more proactive approach to detection by building its own disinformation detection capabilities, while collaborating with platforms, academia, and intelligence agencies to maximize how much disinformation is identified. This collaboration will aim for a culture of data transparency through open data access among the various stakeholders, which will allow for the creation of a Canadian market for online detection amidst the already strong Canadian AI market, reducing Canada's reliance on other countries for tech, and also ensuring that the burden of misinformation detection is not left solely on, large monopolizing platforms. Next slide, please. And so attribution is super important. Attribution is key to identifying who is responsible for spreading disinformation. Collaboration among security alliances, intelligence services, and platforms will help us identify where disinformation is coming from, who is spreading it, and most importantly, why. The key is to foster holistic collaboration between Canadian intelligence and security institutions, perhaps establishing an umbrella organization to oversee complex national security threats like disinformation. By drawing upon the various specialities of these organizations, Canada can more effectively identify the nature of this threat. Collaboration will also foster a culture of multi-stakeholder data transparency, enabling long-term public-private collaboration that will protect us against future digital security issues. Super important when it comes to the large, kind of multifaceted side of the Canadian information ecosystem. So, yeah, next slide.
So thank you. Building on the first step, now we have our following response, which is two-pronged. First, we have an immediate response, which we call active cyber defense. It's action aimed at disrupting the source of this information. We think the lead will be the Canadian Armed Forces, but also working in partnership with the CSC. It addresses specifically the problem of undermining the Canadian democratic process. We think that CAF and CSC should take an active role in trying to disturb and block the access of the troll farm. If it's a troll farm to the internet, maybe go even further, try to go into their computer and block their access to the internet. This approach leveraged the nexus between the information domain and the cyber domain that we are seeing right now. It also directly impacts the production of this information and its dissemination, which will have a direct impact, which will be felt immediately. This operation and this action is also covered by nature. Therefore, it will lower escalation risk. Because it will not be attributed. Also, it's limited in its scope. We don't want to go active. For instance, if it's Russia, we don't want to act Russia itself. We just want to attack the troll farm. So it lowers escalation risk. It's also feasible as planned for joint operation between the Canadian Armed Forces and the Communication Security Establishment are part of Canadian Armed Forces Department plans since 2022. So resource and tools already exist. On a more sustainable side, we want Global Affairs Canada to engage with third countries, other countries and our partner, to build law enforcement cooperation agreement so that these countries, if it is discovered and located that a third country is hosting a Russian troll farm, their police force, law enforcement force, can directly intervene to stop the spread of disinformation. Because what's done in the cyber domain, of course, is something, it can have consequences, but there's still a gap, and we think that on the long run, building trust and agreement with partners could be an effective way to make it harder for foreign adversaries to offshore the troll farms and therefore increase the cost of cyber disinformation.
So as much as it is important to target foreign agencies or actors who might be dealing in misinformation and in preparation for the 2025 federal election, we've realized it's also very important that we have a domestic response to misinformation, because the domestic factors are key in perpetuating and disseminating disinformation, and it's important that we have, as my colleague said, a multi-stakeholder approach to this issue. So one of the main ways that we want to approach this is by distributing educational materials through Elections Canada. We believe that Elections Canada as an institution can play a greater role in making the public aware of the threat of misinformation, especially as it pertains to electoral structures. And doing so would essentially allow Canadians to identify and counter disinformation independently without, the assistance of either civic bodies or government bodies or corporate bodies. A second approach that we want to take is building some unity among Canada's political parties around the issue of disinformation. And we all know that polarization is growing. This is one of the key things that we want to address with relation to misinformation. But at the same time, in Canada, we have been able to achieve a remarkable degree of partisan unity over a number of issues. Russia and Ukraine is one notable example at the moment. And so something that we want to kind of build on is not necessarily mandating, but encouraging political parties to take a common stance on disinformation. We acknowledge that disinformation does tend to aid certain parties more than others, again, especially in the context of the federal election that is upcoming. But that said, we believe it's important that all parties essentially make a statement on disinformation, discouraging it and saying that voters need to be aware of it. And the way that we were thinking that this could be introduced is within the context of something like a debate where we ask a question on it. Now, a third thing that we wanted to discuss was introducing fiscal incentives for private platforms to combat disinformation. As you can see, there are a number of social media platforms that are crucial in disseminating misinformation, and we would not be able to tackle this issue without some kind of collaboration with them. So something that we've been exploring is the creation of tax incentives for platforms to essentially enact evidence-informed disinformation combating techniques, such as community account bans, addressing algorithmic bias, and systematically preventing echo chambers. And some of this will help address the way in which misinformation is distributed, in that it often tends to be targeted at vulnerable populations, ones that tend to be most susceptible to radicalization. And so another short-term policy change that we would like to see introduced, again, in preparation for the 2025 federal elections, is distributing educational materials through Elections Canada and through a number of other agencies. And something that we are going to discuss in the longer term, but is important in this regard, is kind of fostering more collaboration between federal and provincial agencies, because we realize that education often resides under provincial jurisdiction, but we believe that it's important that if we're going to meaningfully address misinformation, we target it from a federal and provincial standpoint.
So as my colleague discussed, a large part of our long-term initiative to counter disinformation is a national education initiative that would leverage federalism, federal connections with the provinces to hopefully increase curriculum for all Canadians about critical thinking, about proper citations, how to identify false information, for instance. We also propose an initiative that would support local news organizations in a greater way than the federal government is currently doing. We know that local newspapers, local radio, it's not a good time to be in that business. But we want to make sure that that isn't the case, because we believe that when people have access to reliable news about their communities and about the issues that directly impact them, that will revitalize these communities by connecting people more to their local issues. It'll give Canadians greater access to reliable and pertinent news and reduce their dependence on online sources. So the idea behind this kind of inoculation concept is that even though disinformation is going to be a threat, we want to mitigate how impactful and how important that threat might be. And we believe that local news is a very, very large part of that. We also suggest exploring the creation of an immigration pathway for tech workers, particularly from countries that are the source of this disinformation, as a way of kind of draining talent pools for these campaigns, while also enriching Canada's own technological ecosystem and improving our potential defenses against disinformation, and hopefully bringing some more talent to Canada. And finally, we want to explore data ownership legislation legislation. This would be similar to the EU's highly successful General Data Protection Regulation as a way of empowering Canadian consumers to own their data and understand how their data is used, as a way of mitigating the role that automated platform recommendation algorithms have in inspiring polarization and in feeding people information that may be false.
In conclusion, we think that the combination we propose of short and long-term solution is both comprehensive and because it's platform agnostic and adversary agnostic, for sure we craft these solution having Russia and specific platform in mind, but we think that it can be applied both in 2025 federal complex and also going forward. It also strikes a balance between, of course, keeping Canada safe and our democratic process up and running, but also keeping our information system open and free to input. Thank you.
Do we jump in with questions at this point?
Yeah,
just to clarify. Yeah, okay. Okay, I can start off with a question. Can you take me through the identification and attribution process? So say, you know, rather than on sort of like a large scale, there's going to be, you know, AI and you know, there's going to be this, I guess, technical way that things are identified. Let's say there's one news story, it comes out, it's circulated on social media, you know, the moms are sharing it on Facebook kind of thing. How is it flagged? And how do you, through your process, you know, at a high level, figure out that that is coming specifically from a certain country or group?
Yeah, I think I can take this. So there's a variety of techniques for this kind of detection. You know, there's natural language processing techniques which focus on the actual content of the information. There's also network-based techniques which are great because they're multilingual. They don't depend on the actual content. They just rely on a particular signature in which disinformation is commonly shared. So structurally, techniques would be decided upon by, you know, kind of intelligence, private, academia collaboration. At that point, as far as attribution is concerned, there would be kind of public-private collaboration to kind of gain mutual access to network data, to data tracing throughout the networks. Like these kind of misinformation attacks will be coming from, you know, specific IP sources. So it should be a fairly recognizable signature as far as detection that way is confirmed, but that really relies on access to, you know, cloud providers' networks.
And if I may add something to bounce off on Ben's comment, also for the attribution, we in Canada, we are part of Five Eyes, so we can leverage the knowledge of our allies, such as the US, to go through maybe some other routes. You meant they probably have some source in Russia and China and other adversaries too, that could inform policymaker about the source and, well, who's the patron, where is it coming from, and what's the goal. So that's the other route, maybe through UMint also.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I think something that we are trying to emphasize in this policy framework is fostering collaboration between a number of different institutions. And I know we've tackled that on the foreign level, we've tackled that on the diplomatic level, we've tackled that in kind of a public-private level, but we believe that tackling disinformation is going to necessitate drawing upon a variety of resources. And we think the fact that Canada has so many agencies that are either dedicated to some sort of intelligence sharing or following these leads is valuable, but the problem is they're often not united under a common agenda. And so that's why we were discussing something like creating, you know, a national security agency, an umbrella organization, which has the imperative to address disinformation and can pull upon these resources while also leveraging connections to the private sector, which is going to be important, as Ben said.
And to address that point about what do you do when it's already, you know, the moms are already sharing it in their Facebook groups, that's where that education component really, really becomes important, because we know that disinformation is online. There's not too much that we can do about that in terms of it existing in the first place, but one of the things that we can do is inform Canadians about how to identify it, where it might be coming from, why it's bad, and hopefully encourage them to not share it.
Okay, so I'll try to pull still on this. So on attribution, two things. So on one hand, what do you do when it's not foreign state actors, but just foreign groups or citizens or news organizations or political parties? So the state attribution is weird and different. That's the first part. The second part, what do you do if it's in your allies? If it's in countries that you are actually not thinking that they're part of the problem, right? It's easy to kind of go after Russia and after China for state farms. What do you do if it comes from the US, from the Republican Party, from the French right groups? Do you knock them down with cyber attacks? So I think I'll just stop there. So I want to see where this goes, because I think it's one of the major point that you try to convince here, or us, on that one.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. Now, when we were kind of given the scenario and we were talking about it with various mentors and the organizers, we were informed to kind of focus on this sort of foreign advocacy angle. Our background information was primarily about Russia, China, Iran, and state-perpetrated disinformation campaigns. However, but you do have a point about how general this kind of threat is, right? It's not your conventional method of warfare. It's not even your conventional method of informational warfare. We're talking about disinformation as a very large, nuanced, global problem that can come from anywhere, and it can even come unknowingly. So that's sort of where the other stages of our policy come into play, because while we understand we can't necessarily target our responses to the Republican Party, for instance, or even just private groups, or even just individuals, clubs, teenagers who think that it's funny, the legal backing and the justification for really heavily targeting these groups, it's lacking compared to a state actor. However, the other elements of the policy about inoculation, about making sure that people can recognize disinformation, that they know not to spread it, that they know where it comes from, and why it's important that they don't spread it, that's where that comes into play. It becomes a very individual-centric type of response in that sense, but at the end of the day, a lot of the policy is about trying to mitigate the effect that disinformation can have. There's only so much that we can do to prevent it from coming in. The goal is to prevent a large-scale effect of disinformation. We don't want it to sway an election. We just kind of want it to be there and we can laugh at it, And
I'll add to that, actually, as much as, public cloud providers in Canada can have disinformation kind of coming onto their servers from foreign computers, they can equally be, sources, kind of hosts for disinformation campaigns. We've seen that happen in the US. So I think, again, that private-public collaboration would mean that, coming up with data security standards for recognizing when cloud infrastructure is used to host these kind of campaigns is super important.
Yeah, and I think something finally, just to round this off, I think we kind of want to acknowledge that we know that misinformation and disinformation is highly decentralized, and a lot of the time it isn't going to come from necessarily state actors. And so something that we kind of discuss, especially with relation to allied nations, whether it's Sweden or Switzerland or the US or whatever, is kind of building connections, bilateral connections with other countries, so that we can kind of leverage their state agencies to target troll farms in foreign countries. And, I think something that we kind of discussed with relation to this is the idea of torrenting, and the fact that it's very difficult to shut down torrenting because the source code can essentially be replicated very, very easily, right? And so one methodology of approaching that, which pertains not only to torrenting but to disinformation, is, yes, working with intelligence agencies in other countries and employing them essentially to target those that are, sending disinformation either on a global scale or specifically to Canada. Because arguably, if it's not coming from state actors and it's with allied nations, that may even make it easier for us to kind of shut down some of those networks.
Just a quick follow-up. I've heard, cloud providers, be called out like specifically as, a target/source here. What is like so specific or special about cloud, like specifically as a part of your solution here?
Yeah, I mean, so most social media platforms which are where misinformation is being propagated are hosted on cloud providers, AWS, Google Cloud. Most of these kind of large-scale social media platforms exist on the cloud now. So it in a sense helps that there is one centralized place in terms of hardware to look. Obviously, there is a layer of kind of social media providers are where you would look for the content. Cloud providers are where you look for the kind of network traffic that suggests that disinformation campaigns are ongoing.
Okay. I have another question completely unrelated to the attribution piece, but I don't know if there were more questions on attribution, or I should just jump right in. Go right in? Okay. So curious, you said part of your solution was, speaking to local newspapers and media, putting together a strategy on disinformation, putting information out there about, what is, especially around elections, what is factual, what is not. Are you worried about getting targeted yourselves, that you yourselves are spreading disinformation and influencing local media with a specific message? And if so, how would you counter that?
That's an interesting question. So first, I'm going to delineate the local news initiative from the education initiative. So we don't want we've talked about this a lot when we were putting together the policy. We don't want the federal government to become a ministry of truth. We don't want the government to control what information Canadians can see. We just want to make sure that we give Canadians the tools that they need to access reliable information, have reliable information about their elections, and can identify threats and people trying to manipulate them when that does happen. So the idea behind the local news initiative is that by launching a federal government program that specifically funds existing local newspapers that have managed to survive, or even revitalizing local newspapers in communities that no longer have them, or even local news radio, for instance, that people are going to become less reliant on online sources for information. They're going to be able to access reliable, good quality journalism within their communities about the issues that are relevant to them. And this is specifically responding to disinformation regarding an election. So that's one part of it. So we wouldn't necessarily be telling local news organizations what to write. We just would assume that they would hire good journalists. And as well as on the education side of things, one of the reasons that we wanted Elections Canada to kind of take the lead on that, if possible, is because they're a nonpartisan organization. They're less likely to, well, hopefully, they're less likely to spread biased information that would support one specific party. And at the same time, the education, it wouldn't necessarily be about specific sources of information or specific content that is present in disinformation. We know that the background guide specifically referred to petrol and gas and everything. We don't really need Elections Canada to distribute information about gas. We just want Elections Canada to tell people, hey, this is how you recognize disinformation. Here are some basic critical thinking skills that you can apply when you see online information. Here are some questions you should ask when you read a news article. Who's sharing, like who wrote it, who are they funded by? Is this a major news organization, or is this a minor website that's a little bit glitchy and has some typos on it, for instance? So that education initiative would have to be like very carefully created, but we don't think that it would necessarily like risk sharing disinformation on its own.
And I think I want to say, we do recognize that there is a risk of this being politicized. You know, if you are funding local news organizations, certainly there are political elements that are divided regionally, especially in a place like Canada. But I think the way that we conducted this discussion and, you know, crafted this framework was kind of like a risk analysis and balancing different risks. And the current status of, you know, the Canadian media structure, which, you know, I think Sarah can speak a lot to, is increasingly an oligopoly by, you know, a few corporations, and the dominance of institutions like CBC over news on a nationwide basis. And ultimately, we do think that although there are risks of, you know, like I said, some political elements being introduced into the dissemination of media when we fund it at a local level, we still see it as a better solution than continuing to fund CBC as the primary or a leading news provider for Canadians across the country, especially when it pertains to localized forms of information and kind of, you know, reducing the emphasis on misinformation that can take forms that appeal to specific constituencies.
Okay, I'll pull on this. So I think you guys are right to be careful and worried about the effect funding news, you know, the news media in Canada will have on people. My assumption would be that trust is a major issue, and if you increase funding, state funding to news organizations, then the level of trust in these organizations will go down and will push away people who will be more susceptible to misinformation. So in essence, trying to increase, you know, the quality of the information, or at least the quality of in the information space, are actually decreasing trust and pushing people away. And I think sometimes we kind of don't address this issue, and we have this kind of, you know, utopian view that if we increase the marketplace of ideas, it's just going to be better. But sometimes I don't think that's work, and I'd like to see that argument fleshed out. But I have like a more specific question. What about news organizations in Canada that sow mis or disinformation? I'll pull, you know, the Rebel News. The Rebel News and all the data we collect shows that it's a major source of misinformation in Canada on all sorts of things, on anti-vaccination, on Russian information. It's all over the place. Do we legislate them? What do we do? Do we send money to them? Like, how do we regulate, or how do we make this work? And then the second part of this question, what do we do with foreign news organizations? You know, most Canadians listen to Fox News or to MSNBC or to BBC or to the Kiev Independent. What do we do with them? So we might end up with increasing the kind of domestic information space, but it doesn't really exist. It's like this international part. So what do we do then? So I want to hear your thoughts about that.
JC, great question. We're out of time. We got nothing to go through. Save that for the next panel.
I would love to answer your question, though, so you could definitely send us an email. We can talk a bit more about this local news initiative once we have more time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So my apologies. While the other team sets up, I'll actually introduce the team that just presented, because I forgot to. So, yep. Just be 2 seconds.
I could just do the. Yep.
Cool. So just as a quick intro of the previous team, there was actually Dua from the University of Toronto, Arnaud Tremblay-Coutenoir from the University of Ottawa. Is that correct? Yeah, cool. And Sarah Parker and Ben Steele from McGill. And now the final team of the day, as people say, last but certainly not least, we have Jonathan Afik-Levi and Aiden Harris from UFT, as well as Madeline Koff from McGill University. The floor is yours.
Awesome. First want to take the time to thank the CDSN, the DND, the Young Minds Program, CAF, and Carleton University for making this opportunity possible, and recognize that we're meeting here today on unceded Algonquin land. We just haven't done that, so wanted to make space for that. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So to begin, given the issue of disinformation within the Canadian information space, and given the scenario that we were given where there is an increased level of disinformation within the 2025 Canadian federal election, our group decided to focus on 3 problem areas that we thought were predominant within this issue. So the first problem area is the trustworthiness of information within the Canadian information space. What we wanted to address with our policies is the trustworthiness of information that Canadian voters are receiving and their ability to fact check this information, which is something that is a bit of a problem within Canada. The second issue is the level of discord that is growing within the Canadian political system. As we have seen over the past decade especially, we have increased levels of polarization that are only growing and not decreasing. So what our group wants to achieve with some of our policies is to decrease the spread of polarization and to bring Canadians closer to the center once again. And the third topic is the potentiality of discord within NATO allies, and especially democratic NATO allies. So with the greater interference of Russia, China, Iran, and other countries, and other non-state organizations that are interfering with our elections and politics, we want to come up with policies that can work with NATO allies to collaborate together on these issues.
Awesome. So like our colleagues that have already presented, we are going to be focusing on a policy regime that emphasizes both short-term, immediate, and long-term resilient responses to this issue. We've identified a couple of key stakeholders: citizens, social media corporations, journalistic institutions, state institutions, and then apparently this isn't the final PowerPoint we submitted because we also have international institutions on that little bullet point.
And just to quickly say, this is an example of a meme you could see in the 2025 election.
So this is the first of our policies, which is really addressing the issue of misinformation in the 2025 election in the short to immediate term. Now, unfortunately, there are very limited responses to countering bot and troll networks. In the very immediate term, in the scenario that we were given, the election is already underway, as is the disinformation campaign. And at that point, it's very difficult to properly address the problem. This is for many reasons, most notably that a lot of these networks of trolls and bots are based and hosted on foreign physical infrastructure and make legal solutions for this difficult, and covert solution for this demand coordination with NATO allies, and demand coordination with NATO allies even more so in light of the situation between Russia and Ukraine right now. So our initial policy, immediate short-term policy to combat disinformation in the Canadian information sphere, is a two-pronged policy approach to, at the same time, preemptively disclose trustworthy information to the public, and specifically information regarding trustworthiness of sources, and notify interaction with false information under the fact. This entire system goes along the debunking and pre-bunking methodology to increase trust in public fact-checking and to increase trust in the information sources that people are engaging with on a daily basis. So if we can go on to the next slide. These are really the sort of quality of fact-checking solutions that we want to legislate, or we would suggest that the House of Commons legislates against social media corporations. So social media corporations should be held responsible for the problems that they're creating in the information space. They very much polluted the information space for their own profit. They mine this information for their own profit, and we believe that as a group, they should be responsible for cleaning up the mess that they made. Now, obviously, this can't be left up solely to private domain, because then again, the information space will be polluted with the best interests of social media corporations. So really, the goal of our policy is to establish a bar of quality rather, for the fact-checking solutions that these corporations implement. Our policy would demand that any social media corporation that operates within Canada implement a standalone fact-checking solution subject to approval by the House of Commons. Specifically, we were thinking that the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics would be the most relevant one for approving this sort of thing. Making this a public democratic process and putting the onus on social media corporations works to increase trust, so that consumers that use these applications know exactly what the process that applications are using to fact check is. More importantly, a lot of these applications already have fact-checking and content moderation solutions built into their applications, many big ones, and this has only grown more prevalent during COVID and the war in Ukraine. This would simply set a bar for what is necessary in order to become a legitimate fact-checking solution. The first mechanism that we think is absolutely necessary goes towards debunking. So one of the biggest problems that we run into with debunking information is debunking information takes time, and the longer time passes from when someone interacts with the information to when the information gets flagged as incorrect by whatever fact-checking solution, the less effective that the fact-checking becomes. We want, to increase the capacity for fact-checking as a whole, but more importantly, for people to be notified after the fact when they've interacted, commented, liked on posts, which were clearly and demonstrably false. The other side of this is the pre-bunking. So every sort of application which is capable of tagging posts of individual users as demonstrably false technically should have the same sort of capacity to track the record of that account, that poster, that site, to track the record and see exactly how often they have in recent time or over the entire existence of the account spread demonstrably false information. This increases the resilience of the Canadian consumers to be able to engage with this information and to be able to more accurately gauge the trustworthiness of the sources that they're interacting with. Now, one of the main differences I want to draw between these two mechanisms is while the first mechanism very much applies to all sorts of content that will need to go through some fact-checking, whether it is posted by the President of the United States or whether it's posted by your uncle. The second mechanism, the one that tracks the trustworthiness of people, is only going to be targeted at those who are most influential in the information space. This is very important because we don't want to single out individuals who happen to be caught in echo chambers or who happen to be caught in bad information or bad faith actor networks. Rather, we want to target those accounts, those sites, those pages which very clearly and directly harm the information space around them. Now, the final part of our policy regarding notification and presentation of disinformation is for these corporations to commit to proportionally increase their company's capacity to monitor and execute these fact-checking solutions as their site grows. Again, this entire thing needs to be subject, this entire policy rather, needs to be subject to public review and public approval to make the process transparent on the one hand and to make the process trust-building on the other.
Okay, so the first policies we went over were focused on combating disinformation within the information space. And we also wanted to introduce policies that could strengthen the pre-existing information space that we have within Canada. And one of the biggest issues in Canada today is that we have no Canadian-specific fact-checking site or fact-checking organization. Many of the most reputable organizations for fact-checking exist in the United States, and there are several in other countries, especially in Europe. What we propose is that the Canadian government should fund a Canadian-based fact-checking site that would focus specifically on Canadian policies, because one of the biggest issues we encounter is that most of these fact-checking sites are oriented towards American politics and global politics in general. there is little focus on Canadian politics and disinformation within the Canadian space. So the ability to fund and create an independent fact-checking site that would be both independent from the government and a completely new body that would be separate from pre-existing media corporations to ensure its reliability is paramount, because it would allow the debunking of information to occur at a faster rate within Canada.
Awesome. So we've just talked a lot about debunking, and that's important, but it's not as effective as pre-bunking. And first I'll say, because we haven't really talked about this a lot, false information is dangerous because of its ability to affect public opinion and electoral discourse. The proliferation of disinformation can enable discriminatory and inflammatory ideas to enter public discourse and be treated as fact. Once embedded, there's sort of a consequence cascade in which Canadian democracy, institutional trust, and polarization increases, but the other stuff degrade, and that's not good. So we propose a media literacy national education initiative to preemptively build resistance against future exposure to false information, both disinformation as perpetuated by bad faith actors, like this case, Russian operatives, but also misinformation, so demonstrably false information that's spread by folks acting in good faith. We propose that we do this through information inoculation, also known as pre-bunking. So an example of this is Harmony Square. You can see from the screen there a screenshot of it, which draws on inoculation theory. This sort of functions as a psychological vaccine by exposing folks to weakened doses of common techniques used to disseminate political disinformation. This game in particular focuses on that during election periods. This is a long-term response to this issue. This game could be, adults can play it, I've played it, but also sixth graders can play it. So we would suggest that this is implemented in schools for children. And if children are playing this game, that is not going to fix the elections in 2025 if we're already experiencing this disinformation.
And so the following slide just shows it's a graph of the final results from this study, the Harmony Square study, and it shows an increase in the ability of participants to weed their way through disinformation. And on the graph, it doesn't look like a major increase, it's only 0.5, but within this area, that is quite a large increase. And you got to remember that these participants partook in one game and one test trial. And just to further clarify that this is just one example of the numerous media literacy campaigns that the Canadian government can run and that independent institutions can run as well.
Awesome. So we've identified 27 NATO countries as allies who could help us raise the reputational costs around conducting disinformation campaigns and help us gain support from other countries to create a coalition to denounce disinformation. So we are interested in continuing collaborative efforts with NATO. You can see up there, Understand and Engage. Canada is really currently an active participant in this working group strategy under NATO. So we're interested in, like our colleagues, detecting and attribution, and specifically having increasing funding towards CSIS and CF Intcom to work with Five Eyes in order to improve attribution capabilities so that we may present accurate info early and routinely, as this is much better than engaging in debunking practices and is more effective. Importantly, we need, and this is a strategy I want to note, may be increasingly effective given the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. It should be easy to rally our allies to our aid on this issue. We really think it's important to mobilize collective action in the international community on this issue in order to promote favorable norms. And on that note, we're going to go to our last slide here. This is just an overview. We the other presentation had this sort of at the beginning, so you'd get to see our roadmap, but you're looking at it now. These are what we've just presented in terms of immediate responses and long-term strategies on this issue. And with that, we'll turn it over to the judges for questioning.
I'll start. All right, so question for you guys. So can you give me an example? So at the beginning you were talking about, a policy where, social media organizations would be responsible for conducting their own sort of fact checking, and they'd have to have their own sort of in-house ability to do that in order to be operational in Canada. Curious if you have specific thresholds in mind, like what would make, so you mentioned for instance, some social media companies already have fact-checking abilities. What is something that you'd like to see that maybe you're not currently seeing, or what's an example of a criteria that you would need to see in order to be satisfied with a social media company's fact-checking solution?
Yeah, so I can take this question. I think absolutely the most important thing is the notification after the fact and keeping a record of it before the fact. I think if we are going to leave this up to social media companies to choose what is true and not functionally, right, if they're serving as the fact checkers, and we've decided on a balance of risks that we don't want the federal government to step into this process. We want the federal government to be responsible for monitoring this process and to be responsible for making this process transparent so as to build trust. But at the end of the day, it is up to the consumer what social media company they're going through, and so long as they have the information of what the fact checking is, that decision that the consumer ends up making as to which applications they use becomes a lot more informed. But I think that the absolutely most important thing is the notification before the fact and the notification after the fact, so that individual consumers, when they engage with this information, they can gauge their own sense of veracity from the information, from the people they're engaging with, and after they interact with false information, they can actually become actively informed. Right now, in a lot of these fact-checking solutions, if you go back to the post, for example, that was flagged or taken down as misinformation, you would see that the post is no longer there, or there's a small notification at the bottom of the post saying, by the way, this is a lie about COVID, please go to the federal Canadian website. But that is not enough. That is not engaging enough for most people, because they will still just read the front headline of misinformation, as is, the human impulse to choose the easiest route. If you get a notification on your phone that's the same as when you get a notification from a DM from a friend that says, by the way, 2-3 weeks ago you liked a post or you retweeted something, that is demonstrably false. And this is why it's demonstrably false. That makes fact-checking significantly more durable and increases Canadians' capacity to engage with false information in a way that is good for them.
Yeah, and importantly, this isn't really in-house. We're sort of instituting a bit of a Peruvian tax to make these companies be responsible for the social harms that they're creating. So this fact-checking, we're not just asking monopolies to fix the situation they created. They already have enough PR teams saying that they're doing that. This is distinct from that. I apologize if that wasn't clear in our presentation.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay. All right, so I only get one question, so now I have to choose which one I want to pull on. I'd like your thoughts on who in the Canadian space should do the attribution and data collection part. And I think this is a question that both teams kind of alluded. Should the Canadian government collect data on what Canadians say on social media, and if so, how and where? So either the platforms are doing it and somehow you find them accountable for what they're doing, and you have a trust and verify organization, considering that most of them are foreign companies, that becomes an issue for that part. So how do you do it specifically? Like, what kind of legal, sandbox or environment would you create to make that happen, so that we have a clear sense of what kind of misinformation is spread in Canada and which one is important and which one is not?
I can start answering this question. You guys feel free to pitch in. But generally speaking, I think the question of attribution is fundamentally different when you're considering attribution to foreign actors and attribution to domestic actors. The question of domestic actors is fundamentally important, and unfortunately wasn't a big part of the scope of the problem that we were given. I think given the particular example that was given was a 15% petroleum tax, I see a very high chance that there were domestic factors. If that is the sort of propaganda or disinformation that is being spread, I see a lot of domestic interests that would be very much happy with that being the message proposed. When we are talking about foreign actors, undoubtedly there's a much broader range of legal recourses, and there's undoubtedly a much broader range of cooperation with allies that can be done. When it comes to monitoring what Canadians think and say on social media, there really are no good options to my personal mind. I think the solution of monitoring what Canadians say by their government is ethically problematic, but equally, I think that the fact that everything that we do say on social media is being recorded and sold, even if it's anonymized and aggregated by big data companies, is no less ethically bad. We actually, in our discussions, had a lot of talks about whether or not the federal government has some sort of right to intervene and become a player in this data market, which is, a lot of modern policy solutions regarding problematic markets right now are actually centered on not the government replacing the private sector market, but rather the government becoming a key stakeholder and a key player in the market, so that regulation can flow from there downwards to the rest of the market. So really, when it comes to attributing disinformation that comes from domestic sources or domestic groups, monitoring is far less of an effective issue, an effective policy rather, and this is where, coupled with the creation of a Canadian-based fact-checking site and much increased funding and capacities for media literacy, this can be left up to individual Canadians, because at the end of the day, we don't want to get into freedom of speech and freedom of expression issues with the government actually regulating what you say on social media, or that having any sort of repercussions on you in the material space. In the digital space, I think that is absolutely left up to social media companies, and that's where regulation does need to come in. If that answer made any sort of sense. I kind of rambled at the end.
It's not an easy topic, so I think everyone is rambling on this, so that's okay.
Yeah, I can just add really quickly, Canada already really does have a very strong internal detection. If something is happening if your aunt tweets something that's hate speech and Twitter doesn't take it down, you're going to be prosecuted. So there already is a little bit of infrastructure there. CSIS isn't collecting data on Canadian citizens going out of their way to do that, but if they have a warrant, they can. So that is, just to say that there already is some infrastructure here. Yeah. We're not advocating a surveillance state on Canadians.
What we really wanted to do was strike a balance between government involvement and holding social media companies accountable and making sure that they are involved in the process as well. Because we ended up really wanting to avoid major government involvement, because like you said in your question for the last group, that just ends up creating way more mistrust in the government, and there's already increasing levels of mistrust. So the more the government becomes directly involved, the greater the mistrust will be, right? So with the way we have it set up with the committee, and with the committee reviewing what social media companies bring forward as their fact-checking solutions and as their notifying solutions, allows this back and forth process between the government and these social media companies.
It also allows the solutions to become adaptive on an application-per-application basis. Regulation for Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and, French startup social media companies will all fundamentally need to be different, as will the resources allocated to them, as is definitions for what counts as a popular or influential account. So this allows for a lot greater flexibility and in an ideally transparent process.
Thank you very much.
Cool, and then obviously a round of applause for our judges one last time. So awards are technically supposed to start in 1 minute, but that's not going to happen. So take a quick 5-minute break just to walk around, and then we'll be back for awards.